Gypsy Rose Blanchard is really a case that is one of the most bizarre and unsettling true crime stories. This is a case that gripped the nation. It's a story of manipulation, desperation, and a shocking act of violence born from a lifetime of deceit. The deceit is by the mother of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, and the violence was then at the hands of Gypsy Rose Blanchard. Get ready to really challenge your perceptions as we delve into the world and what happens. We want to find out what happens when a child's desperate yearning for freedom, for a normal childhood, turns deadly. So imagine, if you will, a life lived almost entirely within the confines of medical appointments and hospital rooms. That's all you know. That's your only frame of reference. For you as a child, it becomes normal. That was the reality for Gypsy Rose for the better part of her young life. Her mother, Dee Dee Blanchard, seemingly to outsiders, was a devoted caretaker, and she was chronicling Gypsy's numerous and severe illnesses: leukemia, muscular dystrophy, epilepsy, severe allergies. That's only the tip of the iceberg. The list went on and on of what the mother said to doctors. These are symptoms, these are things, and she was then diagnosed with all of these things. This family of two, Gypsy Rose and her mother, were a fixture in their community. They lived in Springfield, Missouri, and they were the recipients of charity because of all these medical needs for Gypsy. They had Make-A-Wish trips, an outpouring of sympathy for their seemingly insurmountable struggles. Dee Dee, the mother, painted a picture of a frail, childlike daughter dependent on her every breath. But behind the pink wheelchairs and feeding tubes lay a sinister secret. The sin is envy. Envy is defined as the desire for oneself and to destroy another's good fortune. It can also be part of jealousy. This is the why behind the crime, the motive. I'm Ashley Willcott. I'm a TV anchor, a former judge, a trial lawyer, and I can tell you that every case I've ever dealt with almost exclusively deal with and intersect with one of the 7 deadly sins as the motive: pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, and sloth, the opposite of these 7 heavenly virtues, temptations that, taken too far, turn deadly. Today, we dive in to 2 different crimes. Number 1, the systemic abuse of a child, Gypsy Rose Blanchard, a vulnerable child abused at the hands of her mother, and the murder of Dee Dee by Gypsy Rose. A little later, I am joined by the perfect guest for this, a constitutional attorney, to talk about not only envy, but what you have a right to do with your child constitutionally, KrisAnne Hall, where we will go deep on the how and the why of the envious actions of her deranged mother and her murder. Let's get into it. This is the Deadly 7. As Gypsy began to grow older, her facade began to crack, at least for her. In reality, Gypsy wasn't sick the way the mother said she was sick. She could walk. She didn't need to be in the wheelchair. She did not have cancer. She had multiple surgeries that were deemed unnecessary and damaging. Dee Dee, it turned out, we learned, suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy. That's what it used to be called. Now it is known as factitious disorder imposed on another. It's a really interesting diagnosis, and it is when the mother, caretaker, thrives on the attention and sympathy generated by the daughter's supposed illnesses, and it creates a meticulous set of lies that the mother relied on. She was not envious of money, of wealth, of things, of new nails, none of that. She was envious of the very life that was systemically denied to her by her own mother who should have been the one who cherished and protected her. Gypsy saw other teenagers going to school, having friends, experiencing first loves, and she was trapped in this cycle of medical deception and isolation by her own mother, Dee Dee. This simmering resentment, this deep yearning for a life that she knew was deserved, but she was forbidden from having by her mother, just festered within her. Here's what happened in our digital age that we all live in. Even in the most controlled environments, no matter what we do to prevent our kids from being on digital devices all the time, connections can still be forged. Gypsy, despite her mother's attempts to limit interactions on the digital devices, she found a lifeline online. Gypsy Rose met Nicholas Godejohn. This was a man who lived in Wisconsin, and their online relationship became intense. It would make me blush, some of the things that we learned they said to each other. It was a secret world where Gypsy could be someone other than that always sick child that her mother portrayed. The bond that she had with Nicholas began to deepen, and she revealed the horrifying truth of her situation at the hands of her mother with Nicholas. She also shared that she was craving freedom from her mother, from being a sick child. That envy gnawed at Gypsy, and she longed for a life that her mother, Dee Dee, had stolen from her through the systemic child abuse that she endured. That morphed into a desperate plan. In June of 2015, her plan was brutally executed. Nicholas traveled to Missouri, and with Gypsy's assistance, he murdered Dee Dee Blanchard in her bed in their house. Gypsy, for the first time in her life, was free from the abuse and controlling behaviors of her mother. But boy, what a horrific cost it was. The truth of this bizarre and tragic relationship between Gypsy Rose and her mother began to unravel very quickly after Dee Dee's death, because authorities found Gypsy healthy and walking, and the years of deception began to surface. The community, who was so sympathetic, who was providing all this charity to the family to help Gypsy Rose, they were reeling from this shocking revelation. Gypsy and Nicholas were quickly arrested and charged with the murder of Dee Dee. Ultimately, Gypsy pled guilty to second-degree murder and served several years in prison. She's out now. Her story really continues to start debate and raise crucial questions about the long-term effects of child abuse and the extreme measures taken by those desperate for liberation. Joining me now, it is my pleasure to have KrisAnne Hall, and many different titles I could introduce you as, but you are a university professor, a former prosecutor, and also, KrisAnne, I wanted to lean into the fact that you're a constitutional attorney, because in talking about Gypsy Rose Blanchard, and we know that she was subject to systemic abuse at the hands of her mother with all these fake medical conditions, and then that she, as a result, killed her own mother. Well, she participated in that. She had Nicholas Godejohn, that she met online, murder her mother. But I want to really talk to you first about just your reaction, your thoughts. It's a double crime, right? They were both victims, which is a little unique when you have a daughter and a parent.
Yeah, I think maybe when I was reviewing this, I was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, so I saw this come across my radar, and it was very interesting to me. I've actually personally been involved with, well, I wouldn't say personally involved, but I know somebody who suffered from this syndrome, to be honest, and it that's also what brought to my attention. But as a former prosecutor, I have a way of looking at things like this, especially criminal, that I have recognized as slightly different than many of the prosecutors. I was a division chief over the misdemeanor division and in charge of training other attorneys. And one of the first things that I always drove home to my attorneys is, look, we are prosecutors, not persecutors. These are people's lives, people who have lives, people who have families and futures. So this is not about win at all cost. This is not about vengeance. This is about justice. And quite often, what is lacking in a prosecutorial office is the understanding that justice involves compassion. And it's not just simply a compassion for a victim, it's compassion for everyone. And the first thing that I recognize about this is that Gypsy's a victim on so many levels. I want to say from the get-go, I would not, as a prosecutor, have probably charged her with murder. What I would have more likely have done is found some kind of solution that involved in-house psychological treatment with regular evaluation on whether she could be reintegrated into society. There would have been a criminal charge, mind you, but I just can't walk away from this without really understanding that the system itself victimized Gypsy again. I mean, she's the victim of her mother. She's the victim of the system that did not identify or learn how to ask the right questions. And now she's a victim by Nicholas, and she's a victim by the prosecutorial system.
Wow, so much to unpack. I do agree. Clearly, she's a victim at the hands of both of them, the prosecutorial system. But I must say this, my concern in hearing that is what kind of precedent does that set? Because then are people going to claim, oh, I was severely abused at the hand of my parents, to try to say, and so I shouldn't be charged with murder, or I should get to go to a treatment facility instead? Does it open the floodgates? That would be my fear. I mean, these are unique cases.
Right.
It's not as if floodgates mean a million cases, but I'm just saying, does it open the doors for people to falsely claim that their parents have abused them?
Well, that's why prosecutorial discernment is so very important. One thing we have to understand, sometimes when we get in the mindset of government, we get in the mindset of cookie cutters. Everything fits in a slot and everything goes in its slot in which it fits. That is not how the justice system is supposed to work. So, of course, it's going to open the door. And by the way, it doesn't open the door. Everybody comes to the prosecutor's office saying, I had a reason, I had an excuse, I'm the victim here. So prosecutorial discernment is so very important. And that's why in my office, we actually took the time to review cases. Unfortunately, especially in big cities, time is a very limited commodity. But that's even when it makes it more important to understand that these are people's lives. You have to learn how to quickly find the cases that fit in the cookie cutter slots, and then find the cases that need more attention. And this is definitely one of those cases.
And the prosecutorial discernment, I think the problem with it, and a lot of viewers have said as they watch trials unfold, it means it's subjective across the nation, as well as I do, what charges a person faces, what a prosecution's office does with charges. I'll use Brian Kohberger. That's an example. I think it was the right thing to do to take the death penalty off the table in exchange for his guilty pleas to 4 counts of murder for all 4 students at University of Idaho. However, there are people who are infuriated and said it's not okay to take the death penalty. If there's ever a case for the death penalty, this is that case. But those are pieces that are left up to the prosecution's office. And I think the frustration with, yes, you should have that prosecutorial discernment. I've been on with you enough to know how seriously you take that and your ethics and your sense of, I'm going to do it right. But that's not everybody. And so across the nation, it becomes pretty subjective of what people are charged with. She did plead guilty to second-degree murder. She did
Right.
not physically kill her mother, Dee Dee. We know Nicholas did, manipulated. Gypsy Rose was vulnerable. An online relationship with somebody she'd never met, an older man. And the things they would say to each other was exceedingly sexual and dressing up and some bizarre, in some people's world, sexual activities that were indicated by the messaging back and forth. But having said that, what do you do about that piece, the subjectiveness of what are they going to be charged with? And in this case, it was the plea to second-degree murder.
Well, there's a lot there to unravel as well. What we have to understand is that first, I think what's important is laws don't stop crimes. That's number one we have to
But they're
understand.
supposed to, right? Like, they're
Well, no, I
supposed
don't think
to.
so. Laws are created to punish people for doing things that society has classified as a violation of someone else's rights. Uh, what stops crimes is people making the decision not to commit them, whether they're based on the penalty, the threat of penalty, or more likely, morality itself. And so the real problem that you're touching into is the morality problem. You have crimes because you have people who cannot respect the rights of others, who lack that moral governor. And so we as a society come together and say, okay, we have to punish people for that. So maybe someone won't do it again. But the reality is morality is a cultural issue. And that goes all the way to the prosecutor's office. And that's why it was always so important to me to have this training, to make the distinction between prosecutor and persecutor, to really, really impress on my team that these are lives, not statistics. These are not cases that we put in our win and loss box. These are people's lives, and not just simply the accused lives. We have family members that will be forever impacted on both sides. And that's why the justice system cannot be cookie cutter. It should be no mystery with me telling you that I am not a fan of mandatory minimum sentences. I really believe that sentencing must be tailor fit. It must be subjective, and it must be guided by true discernment based on justice and compassion and real consequences, but from a community level.
So I think in this case, the community level, I just have to back up and say the victims also were the community. It was a small community, and boy, did they do everything for this family. The mother relied; she was dependent on everybody's charity, and the community gave freely, willingly, and lovingly to them. And you can imagine their deception. So there's a whole group of victims in this particular case that's a little bit different than some cases.
Right.
But when it comes to the sentencing, so Gypsy Rose only, again, pled guilty to the second-degree murder. She only spent several years in prison. And I say only because there are people convicted of second-degree murder that can serve 20
Right.
years in prison easily, if not longer. And so I do believe in this particular case, the reason she only served several years in prison was because of the circumstances and what her mother had done to her for years. So while I understand you're saying it shouldn't have been prison, it should have been treatment, at the end of the day, knowing it was a second-degree murder conviction, how do you feel about the fact? Do you feel good about the fact it was only several years based on all the mitigating factors that were presented?
Well, she really sort of tied the hands of the judge when she pled guilty. And so we're talking about a situation where she actually pled guilty to a specific crime. And that puts a really strong burden on the judge. I mean, you know that. Judges have to make the final decision. I mean, in many, many cases, even the verdict doesn't dictate the sentencing. That's really a heavy burden on the judge. And that's why, by the way, our judicial system is established to have our judges come from the communities in which the people will be tried, because our system is set up locally to deal with people, not as numbers. And I believe in this particular case, the judge did the right thing. The
Mhm.
judge says, okay, this woman is not technically pleading insanity. And I don't think that I would, as a prosecutor, allow that sort of plea to take place. I would definitely have charged her with a crime that would involve some sort of incarceration, but then give the option of inpatient treatment in lieu of incarceration, sort of like a diversion kind of option. But the judge, I do believe, weighed the sides of the victims. And we, like you said, we have a massive amount of victims in this case. I mean, think about even the doctors who were manipulated by Dee Dee, who now live with the fact, second guessing themselves, of thinking, why didn't I ask the right questions? Or more importantly, why don't I have training, and why doesn't the system establish a mechanism for me to question and identify these problems? So the judge has this huge basket of variables and influences and victimizations to deal with. And I think in this case, the judge did the right thing.
I agree with you completely, KrisAnne. And I want to talk a little bit about, a lot of people will say to me, I've done child welfare my whole career. It's my passion, but they'll say, why in the world would a doctor ever diagnose a kid with leukemia if they don't have leukemia? Let's see, what were the other things? Muscular dystrophy,
Right.
epilepsy, severe allergies. How does this happen? Well, if you look at the beginning of a doctor's appointment, what does anyone do? You go in and tell them your symptoms.
Hmm.
And the reality is, individuals as caretakers who are then later diagnosed or at some point diagnosed with this and learn how to manipulate the system, and they do their research and they know what symptoms are indicative of what disease. And to your point, there's a system fail because doctors should have recognized it 100%. But they also start to rely on what the parent is saying. And when the parent comes in and says, well, I went to this doctor and she has leukemia, if the doctor trusts that information, which they never should, but if they do, then it goes to the next step of what else is wrong. So it's so much self-reporting. And that's the problem. Here's where I want to get to: parenting. The due process clause of the 14th Amendment. Parents have a fundamental, I know you know this, they have a fundamental liberty interest in raising their children, caring for their children, making decisions for their child. And so I also talk to people, and I saw them in court all the time when I was a judge, who would say, you can't tell me what to do with my kid. This is my kid. I get to do whatever I want. And this kid deserved it. This is why they got that. And I'm not going to take it back. And I'm not going to say I'm sorry, because it's okay that I beat them to, the crap out of them with an iron. That's okay. I get to do that. They're my kid. It's not okay, because that liberty interest in raising your kids the way that you see fit is countered by but you cannot break laws that exist to protect your children. So for instance, in Georgia, corporal punishment is allowed. You can choose corporal discipline for your child. What you cannot do is take it to an extent that it leaves marks and bruises, right? And so their criteria are broken bones, because then it breaks the law. How do you think of, as a constitutional law attorney, protecting the constitutional rights of a parent? And I'm going to say specifically Dee Dee, the mother in this case, protecting her rights if she were still alive, versus and allowing her to raise Gypsy Rose in the way she saw fit, versus crossing a line where it becomes abuse of Gypsy
Right.
Rose.
Well, and that's a really good point to make, and that's something that I even address as a professor, is understanding the difference between liberty and freedom. And so sometimes as a culture, we conflate those two terms, but they're not the same. Freedom is the freedom to do whatever you want, regardless of how that affects other people. That's not the foundation of our American justice system. That's not even the foundation of America's constitutional republic. Our foundation is liberty. And when I teach, sometimes I get a chance, and I love this, to teach the young people, like 6th grade through 12th grade. And I tell them, look, liberty has a very specific definition. Liberty equals freedom plus morality. recognizing that we are free to do whatever we want, but there are some things that we have to choose not to do because they're wrong. And when you come into contact in society with people who can't self-govern in that way, that's where laws come into play to punish them for operating in pure freedom rather than in that aspect of self-governance. Now, what you're describing is a situation where we call bad facts make bad law, right? So you cannot punish all the people who are able to self-govern because a handful cannot. That's why we have to understand laws don't stop crimes. Laws can't be created to prevent crimes, because when you use laws as a matter of crime prevention, then you lose liberty and you become a dictatorship kind of government. The unfortunate reality and fortunate reality of a justice system built on liberty is that we can punish crimes. We have to punish people for what they've done, but we have to have a society where we reinforce morality as a whole and then protect people by punishing after the fact. The system is set up where, and that can be frustrating because the system is set up in such a way that due process protects the innocent, but sometimes it protects the guilty when we don't follow the processes properly.
Exactly. And that does happen sometimes. But our criminal justice system is the best in the world. And so I
Absolutely.
believe in it. I support it. Yes, there are times when it does not operate the way that it should. Yes, there are people in jail that should not be in jail. They are innocent. So there are issues with any system. But
Right.
having said that, the other part of it is that balance between a state's responsibility rather to intervene in a child, to protect a child. So when it comes to children, the state's responsibility is different because they are to intervene and help protect a child when a child's being abused. So some say, again, to a point you made earlier, systemically, how and why did the state never intervene? Well, let's talk about some of the things that Dee Dee did to ensure the state didn't know or didn't have a heads up to intervene. Number one, she doctor shopped. She went from doctor to doctor to doctor. If anyone seemed suspicious, she would disappear and go to another doctor so that they couldn't get enough information to confirm a suspicion to say, oh, wow, I need to report this. There needs to be an investigation. The other thing she did is she isolated Gypsy from family members. She made certain, especially if there were any family members in their family that would question Gypsy's health or lack of good health, that she isolated Gypsy and herself so that they couldn't see Gypsy and they weren't able to then confirm what maybe their gut was, which is something's not right here. So those are the ways that she prevented the system from having eyes to be able to say, well, maybe there's some problems here.
Well, I think that what we're addressing is the real core issue. It's not that the system perhaps didn't have an opportunity to see, but the system didn't have a mechanism to recognize the real problems. Dee Dee was a predator from day one. Um, Gypsy's father was a minor when Gypsy was born. That's not a relationship. That's a predatory act. Dee Dee was 24 when Gypsy was born, and her father was only 17. So we have a system after system. The fact that a parent is doctor shopping should raise some questions. The doctors can ask questions. Am I the first doctor you've been to? Where are they? Pulling previous doctor records. Family members have to have an avenue in which they can actually become part of the eyes. And I think really what we're talking about, and this is the thing that maybe culturally we have a real problem addressing, is that as great as our criminal justice system is, the way America deals with mental health issues is failing. And this is just another one of those situations where we see Dee Dee hiding Gypsy from the system what I actually see as someone who has worked in the system for a very long time,
Mhm.
especially I did juvenile justice as a prosecutor as well. You see a place where the system has a tendency to sort of avert their eyes from mental health issues instead of really getting involved in them. And I think maybe because we don't, as a whole, know how to deal with them, we don't know the real solutions with them, we don't have good processes in place. And that's the core issue, no matter whether it's gun violence or child abuse or dealing with children with disabilities. We have a problem in America dealing with mental health issues.
And we do not have enough treatment, period. It
Yes.
is impossible for anyone. I'd like to think I'm educated enough to find a therapist or to find a doctor for mental health needs. And the reality is, they're too busy. So they don't have any appointments, and there's a long waiting list. Or you may be in a rural area where there are no specific people to address your specific mental health needs. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So this country is lacking mental health
Right.
services in part because it's such a negative connotation to have mental health needs. But
Right.
again, the factitious disorder opposed on another is a diagnosis. It is a mental health need. At the end of the day, and I'd love to get your final thoughts, I think we'll all agree Dee Dee, the mother, was a very sick person.
Right.
Gypsy Rose Blanchard never should have had the life and the raising that she had ever at the hands of her abusive mother. She never should have been diagnosed with all of these many things that she didn't have, living in a wheelchair, not going outside, not seeing family, not seeing friends. It never should have been her existence. But on the other hand, it's a lesson of you still, in spite of all those horrific things being done to you, our system does not allow you to take justice into your own
Right.
hands. And she did by having Nicholas kill brutally the mother in her own bed by stabbing her. Any last thoughts about this case?
Absolutely. Vigilantism is never the right answer in a civilized society, especially one with the criminal justice system that we have the potential to have.
Mm.
The problem with this case, and I'm not making excuses, mind you, is that again, I'm not trying to overestablish the victimization of Gypsy, but when you are in a situation, and remember, Gypsy was literally programmed from birth to be in this mindset that she's broken and she's defective and this is her whole life. Can you imagine? I mean, just imagine the moment that realization sets in that she's not the one that's broken and the person that she possibly loves the most in the entire world is the person who has actually harmed her. She then links up with Nicholas, who then takes advantage of her broken mental state and really acts out his own mental illness through her. And so vigilantism is never the solution. What should have happened is the family should have come through and somehow broke through the barrier, somehow been persistent in really finding out what the issue is. The doctor should have asked more questions. And the last safeguard, Nicholas. Nicholas should have said, Gypsy, let's get you in front of the justice system. Let's tell somebody about this. Let's get the right process going in place. Can you imagine how different things had been if Nicholas had actually been an advocate for justice rather than someone suffering from his own mental illness problems?
Ah, preach, sister, everything you said. And it's also a cautionary tale. We all know this. Be careful who you meet online, right? You don't know who you're meeting. And this is a great example of that as well. And I will say, you can understand, I look at the motive, and this one is to me envy, because you can understand how Gypsy Rose was envious of a normal childhood, of a childhood free of abuse at the hands of her mother, and why she took the actions she took to escape this prison,
Right.
a medical prison that she was put in. by her own mother. KrisAnne Hall, what a great opportunity to really delve into your expertise, because this has been enlightening at the depths of your knowledge and expertise in breaking down these cases. So thank you so much for being on.
Well, it's been a real honor to be here, and it's so much fun. I love having these kinds of conversations, and I love the fact that others can actually, sort of be a part of that conversation too. What a great format you have here.
Well, thank you. Thanks again for joining.
My pleasure.